Greetings to all. I'm very honored to have been asked to share with you today the inspiring story of Heifer International's beginnings. And it's a history in which I've immersed myself for over 2 decades now. And I hope that what I have to say will give you an even deeper appreciation than you already have for the life-changing work that Heifer does today. The opportunities that I've had to gather this history have been a real blessing to me and an incredible gift to me. And in keeping with Heifer's key cornerstone of passing on the gift, today I'm passing on the gift of this uplifting story to you. It's a selfless story of faith and action. It's a story that shows what can happen when a group of people care more about meeting needs than taking credit, more about making peace than making war, and more about extending a hand in love than making converts. You've likely heard the name Dan West mentioned as the founder of Heifer International. I'd like to acquaint you with a piece of West's early history to help you understand the passion out of which the Heifer Project emerged. West was born in 1893 in Preble County, Ohio, and then he was raised on a farm north of the Dayton area. But his interests lay more in books and ideas than in farming. His family had little money to spare, but sometime after West graduated from high school, his parents were ready to get him a buggy so he could date girls. He chose instead to leave home and put that money towards his feeding his inquisitive mind and with various forms of higher education. Essential to West's character was his strong belief in the teachings of Jesus Christ and putting those teachings into action. He grew up in the Church of the Brethren, steeped in its pacifist principles. The Church of the Brethren was one of the 3 historic peace churches, along with the Mennonites and the Quakers. The denomination was founded in 1708 on the belief that all war is sin. But when World War I rolled around, the church was unprepared. It had no alternative service in place with the government for its young men. These men had 3 choices. They could go into the military in combat duty, they could go into the military as a non-combatant conscientious objector, a CO, or they could choose to go to prison. And Dan West was one of those young men facing that dilemma. Well, in May of 1918, at age 24, he was drafted into the Army. And West said he decided to sign up as a CO to test the boundaries of his conscientious objection. And those boundaries were tested when he was assigned to the 39th Machine Gun Battalion. He knew he couldn't even carry a gun, let alone shoot one. So he went to his new captain to get released. Years later, he wrote about that experience, and he said, "The captain cursed me hard, evidently to change my mind, but he didn't. A few hours later, I went back with a new idea, to offer to go to the Fort Leavenworth Penitentiary. My captain did not curse me anymore, but said he could not move me on then." There were a few hard weeks where he was at, and then he was reassigned to the Quartermaster Corps in South Carolina, where this photo was taken. He said, "There I did not kill anybody, but I felt a part of a killing machine. That still hurts my conscience. And I developed a new goal, to work for peace, not for war. That has lasted ever since," he said. Well, fast forward now through 2 decades, of school teaching, school administration, and national church work for the Church of the Brethren. And that passion for doing as much for peace as a soldier does for war led Dan West to become the peace representative for the Church of the Brethren. In 1937, in the midst of the Spanish Civil War, the Society of Friends, the Quakers, invited the Brethren and Mennonites to join them in Spain on a project to provide relief for the women and children who were caught in the throes of that war. Well, Dan West was sent as the salaried Brethren representative to help get this program started. During his several months there, he observed children dying from the shortage of powdered milk. And this just tore at his heart. In his last days in Spain, he visited a children's hospital in Murcia. And there he saw a young girl dying of tuberculosis. And the nurse told him that had there been enough milk, she would have lived. He thought of his own little girl at home. And he said, "This idea struck me hard. Suppose we were unable to provide plenty of food for her right now." I was suddenly determined to do something for these children. And that something was his idea of sending cows to Spain so that people would be able to feed themselves. Simple solution, right? Well, for the optimist that Dan West was, yes, but it would take some heavy convincing for his colleagues back home. It took 4 years, but finally, in April 1942, as the United States was entering World War II, the Church of the Brethren District Men's Work of Northern Indiana, where West was living at the time, took hold of his vision. They adopted West's plan for Cattle for Europe, and they named a committee to put it to work. A few months later, the denomination's newly formed Brethren Service Committee adopted it in principle, and then in January of 1943, they adopted it as a national program and named it the Heifer Project. You may see it referred to as Heifers for Relief, which it was often called in those early years, but the official name was the Heifer Project. And for those of you who don't know, a heifer, as Dan West would say, is a cow not yet. Once it births its first calf, then a heifer becomes a cow. West's idea caught the imagination of people all over the country, and not just the Brethren. Built into the Brethren Service Committee's charter for the Heifer Project from the start was the provision for inviting other interested groups to join. The Fellowship of Reconciliation was the first to join already in 1943. The Quakers Rural Life Association in 1944. The Evangelical and Reformed Church and the Catholic Rural Life Conference in 1945, and on it went, with Heifer Project Committee continuing to grow its membership into an ecumenical body, even while legally being a program of the Brethren Service Committee. It was a very unique hybrid organization. But this ecumenical aspect gave the program a strength far beyond what a small denomination like the Church of the Brethren could have carried out, and led to its incorporation in 1953. Well, the genius of the Heifer Project, I believe, is its passing on the gift aspect, whereby recipients agree to pass on the first female offspring of their animal to another family in need. And as I see it, the incorporation of the Heifer Project, the letting go of it by the Brethren Service Committee, was another form of passing on the gift. Releasing ownership of a program for a larger purpose. And the beauty of that is that today there are Methodists and Quakers and Mennonites and Presbyterians who insist that it was their denomination that started the Heifer Project. It's a program much larger than itself, a program that belongs to everyone with its selfless passing on the gift values. I'm going to share something here that I've discovered in my research for the book that I'm writing on Heifer's early years. Not many people know this, and that is the origin story of passing on the gift. There have been, excuse me, there have been a lot of conjectures about this in the past, but I have the real story in Dan West's own words. In January 1944, the Heifer Project Committee had voted to send Dan to an international cooperative conference on Reconstruction in Washington, D.C. At that time, international cooperatives were exploring the role that they could play in Reconstruction when World War II ended. Meanwhile, the Heifer Project Committee had been exploring the question of how animals they planned to send to Europe could be distributed. The well-established European cooperatives were a prime partner for that, thus Heifer's interest in this conference. A week before leaving for the conference, West wrote to the Heifer Project Committee members. He told them, "Yesterday, I was plain happy to be able to work in my own local church district on the Heifer Project." He explained that he and Heifer Project's first executive secretary, Marvin Singer, had spent the day driving around ear-tagging heifers that had been donated. West said, "We talked over plans between barns. One idea that Marvin passed on sticks in my mind, and I want to consult all of you about it. Some group is working on the idea of lending cattle to European farmers. The receiver would acknowledge the loan and repay it in some way, someday, if he could. Because the cooperative conference at Washington, January 19 and 20, is stressing self-help, not philanthropy, I thought in the back of my mind it might be good to have this idea of a loan. I am a bit skeptical about it, as I think the receivers would be too poor for a long time to repay the loan. How would it be for our plan to ask the receiver of a heifer to promise to pass on to another needy person the first heifer calf born to the heifer we give? I should like to present that as our plan in case it seems right at the conference." And that became Heifer's cornerstone before the first shipment was ever made. So there you have it. Now on with Heifer's beginnings. From the very start, the Heifer Project was a grassroots effort built on the backs of a multitude of volunteers. Local committees were formed, heifers were donated and raised, with the first being Faith, donated by Virgil Mock on the left in this picture and raised by Claire Stein on the right. He was the son of O.W. Stein, who was the first chairman of that first Heifer Project Committee. Other volunteers transported animals across the country, and still others raised the money to pay for it all. There were soon plenty of heifers ready to go, but World War II was raging, and it was simply out of the question to ship animals across the Atlantic Ocean. So in June 1944, the first shipment of 18 heifers, with Faith being among them, traveled by train from Napanee, Indiana to Mobile, Alabama. On July 14, 1944, the date that Heifer International uses as its anniversary date, 17 of those heifers made their way on ship to Puerto Rico. One had gotten sick and had to stay behind. Well, in Puerto Rico, they were distributed by the Farm Security Administration to needy farmers throughout the island. And this is Faith with her calf under the man's arm in her new home in Puerto Rico. The beginning of a long and impressive history of providing dignity to the downtrodden through the gift of an animal. The war in Europe ended the next spring on VE Day, May 8, 1945. And shipping to Europe now became a possibility. But the Brethren Service Committee had a problem. They didn't have ships or money for ships. Besides the fact that all of the merchant ships at that time were under the control of the United States War Shipping Administration. Another organization taking shape during the war provided the solution, and that was the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, known by its initials UNRRA, UNRRA. UNRRA was formed by 44 of the Allied nations for the purpose of providing relief to the devastated Allied countries at the end of the war. The Brethren Service Committee's executive, M.R. Ziegler, was a real mover and a shaker. And he had been lobbying UNRRA in its development stages to include some of Heifer Project's animals in their shipments. But UNRRA had no intention of shipping live cargo. That was until they got a request from the Near East Foundation for bulls for Greece. The country's dairy industry had been devastated during the war, and the bulls were needed for an artificial insemination program to more quickly replace the cows that had been killed during the war. So UNRRA contacted the Heifer Project, and soon a gift of 6 purebred bulls were on their way to Greece on May 14, 1945, just 6 days after VE Day. A ceremony of consecration by the Orthodox bishop was held after their arrival. So as Heifer's second executive secretary, Benjamin Bushong, likes to joke, the first Heifer project to Europe was a shipment of bulls. Well, in the interim, while waiting on shipping to Europe to open up to them, the Heifer Project Committee worked on arrangements for a small land shipment of 4 animals to Mexico and 2 shipments right here to Arkansas, to black and white, needy, low-income tenant farmers. First, there was a shipment by train from Ohio of 19 cattle to Pine Bluff in May 1945. And this, again, was in cooperation with the Farm Security Administration, with our office in Little Rock. The second shipment was by truck from northern Indiana of 18 cattle to Cotton Plant, Arkansas, that July. And this one was in cooperation with the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. This letter gives driving directions to the destination of Mrs. Idella Darby's farm, in parentheses, colored. But in the meantime, requests to UNRRA for livestock began coming in from other countries. So with the success of the bull shipment, they decided, yes, we will include live cargo in our shipments, mainly horses, cattle, and mules, to rebuild the agriculture of those devastated countries. But UNRRA had a problem. Unlike the Brethren, UNRRA had ships. They had 6 ships immediately available to them that had been outfitted as mule carriers during the war. But where would they get the livestock tenders to take care of the animals on their ships? Most men at that time were either still in the military or its alternative civilian public service or working in the defense industry. So, knowing the Church of the Brethren was a mostly rural denomination, UNRRA turned to the Brethren. They thought maybe enough men could be found on farm deferment to accompany their livestock. An agreement was reached then that solved both organizations' problems. And you can believe it was with much fear and trembling that the Brethren Service Committee agreed to be the recruiting agency for the estimated 8,000 livestock tenders that UNRRA would need to ship the 200,000 animals that they wanted to send to Europe. In return, UNRRA would ship the Brethren Service Committee's Heifer Project animals free of charge and under the terms of the Heifer Project, meaning they would be a gift to the neediest of pre-selected farmers and institutions. UNRRA recipients, you see, had to pay a small amount in some way via crops or whatever for their animals. Well, these livestock attendants were quickly dubbed Seagoing Cowboys. And the Seagoing Cowboy office was set up in the newly purchased Brethren Service Center campus in New Windsor, Maryland. The first crew of cowboys departed from New Orleans June 24, 1945, with a load of UNRRA horses for Greece. This was just 7 weeks after VE Day, so you can see how quickly this all came together. And it was so soon after the war that this crew was not allowed to take cameras with them on the ship, for whatever reason. This is the only photo available from their trip that was taken by an enterprising photographer when these guys visited the Acropolis. And it's the only livestock ship I know of that had that restriction. Another ship that left from Baltimore just a couple days later had lots of photos from their trip. Well, over the course of the next 2 years, through April 1947, some 7,000 men and boys ages 16 to 72 served UNRRA as Seagoing Cowboys. They made a total of 360 trips, transporting some 300,000 animals, which besides horses, heifers, and mules, included chicks and some sheep and goats, and even a few rabbits. Of these animals, about 4,000 were from the Heifer Project. 4,000 animals donated or purchased from all around the country and processed in just 2 years' time. The logistics are just mind-boggling when you think of the communication abilities at that point in time. Well, the UNRRA Livestock Program Historical Report says these Seagoing Cowboys were farmers, preachers, teachers, students, veterans, conscientious objectors, ne'er-do-wells and doctors, carpenters, plumbers, painters, and importers. They came from a diversity of religious affiliation and racial backgrounds from nearly every state in the Union as well as Canada. Truly as comprehensive a cross-section of American life as could be found, the report says. What an amazing opportunity these trips were for these men, many of whom had never been out of their county before, let alone out of the country. They went for many reasons, some altruistic, some not so altruistic. If they were under 18, they needed their parents' permission, could be a hard sell. If they were older and registered with the Selective Service Committee, they needed their draft board's permission. also could be a hard sell. Some guys weren't allowed to go by their draft boards. They all had to join the merchant marine to be able to work on a merchant ship with the classification of cattlemen. And for their service, they were paid the whopping sum of 1 cent per month by the merchant marine. This was just a formality to make them legal to work on a merchant ship. But don't feel bad for them. They also were paid a larger sum of $150 per trip by UNRRA. And it was the same whether the trip took 1 month or 3 or 4 months, which some of them did. Oh, their trips were full of drama and adventure and danger and humor and even an occasional romance, where a seagoing cowboy met his bride-to-be overseas or at New Windsor. There's so many stories I could tell, but you can find those on my Seagoing Cowboy website, where I post a blog every second and fourth Friday, sharing stories of the Seagoing Cowboys and the Heifer Project. What I will say about the Seagoing Cowboys now is that they played a significant role in Heifer's legacy. They were some of the first civilians to get into Europe after World War II. I've interviewed over 150 of these men, and a common element of their trips was seeing the devastation of war, whether it was in France or Greece, in Italy or Poland or Germany. And many of these guys came home changed by what they had seen, and they dedicated their lives to serving others and working for peace. And they came home all across the country telling their stories of what they had seen, the devastation and the great need in Europe. Well, when UNRRA disbanded in early 1947, Heifer Project faced a critical juncture. They had just lost their free shipping. At that point, they easily could have just blessed what they had done and terminated the program. And the Heifer Project Committee talked about doing just that. But several factors kept the flame alive. One of those being the passionate commitment of Heifer's many volunteers across the country. And another being the stories of these seagoing cowboys. And this not only gave momentum to the Heifer Project, but to other relief organizations as well, like Church World Service and the Mennonite Central Committee. Well, the years after UNRRA disbanded were momentous ones for the Heifer Project. Their first shipment after UNRRA took place already in April 1947. It had been in the planning stages for a while. It was 25 bulls to Japan, former enemy to which the Heifer Project Committee wanted to extend a hand of peace. With Japan being an occupied country at the end of the war, the only way to obtain entry was through the U.S. Army. So this shipment was arranged through the Army, and shipping was paid for by the Army. And there's a sidelight here. The pattern that the Heifer Project Committee set up from the start of working with governmental and other agencies to achieve their goals. The Farm Security Administration in Puerto Rico and Arkansas, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union in Arkansas, the Near East Foundation and UNRRA in Greece, and this particularly strange bedfellow for the pacifist Heifer Project, the U.S. Army in Japan, and then later in Korea. It was a pattern of collaboration that continues in many ways today. So after this shipment of bulls to Japan, shipments of goats followed for both Japan and Okinawa, another former enemy country. And in 1949, Heifer began a decade of shipments to Germany. This was to help this former enemy resettle people of German descent who had been evicted from their homes in Eastern European countries and sent back to Germany at the end of the war, no matter how many centuries their families had lived in those Eastern countries. This was a provision of the Potsdam Agreement at the end of World War II. So do you see a pattern here? The Brethren Service Committee was very intent on using these Heifer Project shipments for building peace, as we see in this brochure. Do you have a program for peace? We need more projects like this to prevent this. And this pattern continued under the leadership of Heifer's third executive director, Thurl Metzger, after whom this building is named. He made a shipment of hatching eggs to Korea in the midst of the Korean War in 1952, and then a shipment of heifers to Russia during the tense times of the Cold War in 1956. In closing, I want to go back to the German shipments and share two stories with you that speak of Heifer's legacy. The Potsdam Agreement created a huge dilemma for Germany, with the Eastern European countries and even some Western European countries expelling people of German descent. After the war, the new government of West Germany had to find places to resettle some 10 to 12 million of these displaced persons in a country that was struggling to recover themselves from the war. One of these places was the Reichswald settlement, which was being cleared out of a damaged forest in northwest Germany. Well, in June of 1950, Heifer Project delivered 42 heifers to the families in this settlement. In 2013, I had the phenomenal opportunity to travel to Germany and meet with 11 of those recipient families. They told me of the horrendous experiences they had lived through during and after the war before finding their way into this Reichswald settlement. They came from several different countries, some as far away as Romania and Lithuania, all German-speaking people, but with different dialects. And I asked them, had it been hard to form a community coming from such a variety of backgrounds? They said no. Our need welded us together. We all had nothing. One statement made by Mariana Arts summarizes the importance of the Heifer Project shipment for these people and for the thousands of other heifer recipients throughout Germany. Mariana said when they received their heifer that June of 1950, they wondered who would give us such a large gift. Up to that point, she said, everything had been taken away from us. Who would give us a cow? She said, our heifer lifted us from the depths of despair and gave us hope. And folks, that's Heifer's legacy. Lifting people from the depths of despair and giving them hope. Well, the second story comes from a translated letter that I found in the Heifer archives. It's from Yugoslavian refugee to Germany, Jakob Renner, that he wrote to his donor from Michigan in October 1949. It was one of the very first shipments that Heifer made to Germany. Mr. Renner writes about the difficulties of having to leave his 100-acre farm in Yugoslavia that had been in his family for 5 generations. And then finally, after passing through many refugee camps, relocating in a German village with only 5 acres of what he said was very sandy, bad soil. He concludes his letter like this. My dear Mr. Hartzler, it surely takes lots of love to give a cow away. But you hardly know, and I can't express what a great joy you gave to my family. It's hard to say what it means after 5 years to have a cow in the barn again. There came many packages from the U.S., and always my daughter asked, Daddy, don't we have any relatives there so that they could send us a package also? I just could comfort her with the words, don't worry, God will carry us through the need. And now look, an unknown human being gave us through God's blessing not a little package. No, he gave us a life to help us out of the deep need. It isn't only the material value alone. It meant so much more to us. We received more courage for living. Another legacy, more courage for living. And as seen in this image, Heifer's is also a legacy of love. You call her the cow of goodwill. We call her the cow of love. And it's a legacy of joy. Just look at the joy on the faces of the giver and receiver in this pass-on ceremony. A person who had once been a receiver now has the dignity of becoming a giver. Hope, courage, love, joy, and the list goes on, I'm sure. A rich legacy it is. A legacy rooted in the passion for peace of Dan West and his colleagues. And a legacy carried on today by Heifer's staff all around the world and by Heifer supporters like you. And I thank you. I just want to acquaint you, if you aren't, with the picture book that I've written, the Seagoing Cowboy. I'll have copies available over in the dining hall for anyone who wants to purchase one. They're $20, and it can be by cash or check. I don't have Visa. I also wanted to acquaint you with another book that came out in November, written by a Canadian professor of history. It's Relief on the Hoof, the Seagoing Cowboys, the Heifer Project, and UNRRA in Poland. And so this focuses pretty much on that period of time in Poland. And I served as a consultant for this book, and it really is quite good. And I do have a handout here that you can pass around. These are notes if you have questions or comments. Yes, Cynthia.
How did you find, were your records so good that you could find, I mean, your research is, I commend you.
Thank you.
But
Thank you.
What were the records? What were you going through?
Yeah.
How did you live?
Cynthia said, how did I find the information? It's been like putting a picture puzzle together. Heifer's, the archives at Heifer's were kind of splotchy. I mean, there was a lot of information there. I spent several trips down here going through Heifer's archives. I went through the Brethren archives in Elgin, Illinois. I went through some of the Mennonite archives. I went to the United Nations for UNRRA's archives. And then from people, you know, the interviewing of the cowboys, and they were so generous in passing on information to me. I have 25 banker's boxes of materials in my office at home. Yeah. Other questions, comments? Yes.
At the very beginning in Indiana, when the plan was adopted, when I think about the plan it's hard, there seems like there are a lot of logistics at the back end, like if they're heifers, they are not yet cows, they have to become cows. Was that kind of figured out too? And then how to distribute the heifers once they got to, Europe?
They started out with 6 trial congregations in northern Indiana, and the committee had put together a listing. So if someone was going to donate a heifer, then they would keep it until a certain point. And then the heifers that they wanted to send needed to be bred so that they get 2 animals when they're
So when
delivered,
they
actually.
on the boat, they were already then inseminated?
Yes, and there were several that couldn't make it to their country and gave birth on the ships. I've interviewed one guy who, he was on a trip to China. It was an UNRRA trip, and they had a calf beauty contest because they'd had so many babies born on the ship. Yeah, but they had to go through several different kinds of vaccinations for the animals, like for Bang's disease and all of that. So there was they had a process in the works. Yeah, and then eventually they developed a collection center, the Roger Roop Farm, near Baltimore, Maryland, because Baltimore was the first shipping point that they used. So the animals would be trucked or go by train from wherever they were, whether it was Idaho or Indiana or Pennsylvania. They'd be taken to this collection center to be processed and be ready then to be put on the ship. So, yeah, it was. When you think about the logistics, it's just mind-boggling, because in that office I showed you, there was a woman, Carol West, was on the phone calling Seagoing Cowboys, saying, be at this port at this time, and I mean, the logistics are just mind-boggling. Yeah. Other questions?
I don't know how to say it. Are there, could any brand, how do you say, of heifer be accepted?
Oh, breed.
Breed.
Any breed. It's a good question. For the most part, yes, but there were some countries where they wanted specific types of cattle. Holsteins were a popular breed. Brown Swiss was especially good for Greece because they were a little hardier for the climate and the mountains and everything there. So yeah. Yes.
Try to keep it alive. When UNRRA stopped being able to ship, there was this perhaps existential crisis at the Heifer Project. Was Mr. West still there at the center of that?
Was Mr. West still at the center when the crisis of no free shipping? Yes, he was very much. He was never employed by Heifer. He served as the recording secretary on the first committee through several years, and then he stayed very much in touch with the committee all through the rest of his life, and he was a force of nature. Yeah. Yes.
So Dan West was a peace warrior, and we live in these times where peace is the casualty. Would he be turning in his grave?
Would he what? Oh, be turning. Dan West being a peace warrior in today's society, would he be turning in his grave? Yes. I mean, he would be out there doing all he could to. He had incredible. The church leadership at that time had incredible contacts with the government because they had worked with trying to get the alternative service put into place for the civilian public service camps. So Dan West had all those connections. He traveled a lot for his work with the church. He was gone probably at least half of the year from his family. And he was not a farmer, I'm sorry. it's in a lot of PR stuff that he was a farmer, but he was a church worker who just gave minimal time at the little farm that they owned, his family actually, and hired help, did the farming there. But yeah, he had ecumenical connections. I mean, just a real web of connections. So yeah. Yes.
What about the Church of the Brethren? Is it still involved?
Is the Church of the Brethren still involved? Yes. Yes. We are still a peace church in terms of our basic beliefs, but many of our congregations have gone in different directions. Peace is not taught as much at the local church level as it used to be, and a lot of that changed. It probably began to change with World War I, but there was the selective service system for World War II, but a lot of the young brethren men went into the military, and that began to kind of diffuse the peace position. But at the top of the denomination, yes, it's very much involved.
What's involved with Heifer?
Involved with Heifer, we have a permanent member on the board of directors from the Church of the Brethren. Yeah. Yes.
What's your background? Are you a trained historian?
My background.
She is now.
I'm a historian by default. I got into this because my grandfather had been a seagoing cowboy, but I didn't know that until after he died. My father gave me an envelope of his photos, and I had gotten interested in writing for children, taking a correspondence course in writing a novel, and I gave my instructor the idea of a 16-year-old seagoing cowboy going to Poland, and she said, that's something new and different under the world. So that got me started on research. And I soon realized that this was a story hiding away in people's minds and drawers and attics. And my mission kind of changed then to documenting the history. So, yeah, and it just, I mean, it developed. I don't consider myself a historian by training, but people call me a historian, so I accept that.
Did the Cowboys go from point of origin to the ports to Europe, or did they just pick up at the ports and go?
Did the Cowboys go from the port of origin?
Where the cows?
Where the cows.
Donated.
Okay. Some of them did. I mean, on my blog I've got some posts about cowboys from Idaho, or one of the, there were a couple of them from the western coast that took the train across, and their experience of doing that, and then went with the cattle. But most of the cowboys just went directly to the port or to the Brethren Service Center. Some of them would go there, and if there were a longshoreman strike at the port of Baltimore, they might have to stay there 2, 3, 4 weeks before their ship was able to leave. So, yeah. It was incredible experiences for these guys. Yes.
Were there any countries that were like, that's okay, we don't want your help, like after the war? Was it all Western Allied countries, or were there like Soviet countries within the Soviet? I know you said that in the 50s they sent heifers to the Soviet Union, but
yeah.
was there that tension after the war where countries that were allied with the Soviet Union, that's okay, we don't want your help?
Yeah.
Because I know in Greece, after the war, Greece could have gone communist, or it could have gone, and there was a big issue there, and that's why kind of they were trying to stop it from going communist. But I'm just wondering, was there tension like that with other countries in Eastern Europe?
There may have been, but the Brethren had their contacts, and the ecumenical people had their contacts. So it was mostly by request. The responses were more by request than by seeking out places to take animals. Yeah, I mean, they had, the Heifer Project Committee minutes show, we had requests from here, and they had to determine, what's the best use of our funds and resources, and then choose the place to
Yeah, 'cause
send
like
them.
with the Marshall Plan, that was very focused on Western Allied countries, like the Soviet Union didn't really participate in that. I'm just wondering, was there a similar kind of split here with this program?
They were open. The Heifer Project was open for wherever requests came from, they'd consider it, yeah. Yeah. How are we doing on time?
We're just about at the time for our break. Does anybody have any more questions?
We could be here all day.
Okay, well, can we all thank Peggy for this amazing presentation?